If creating audio for VR is a complete mystery to you, then this episode is just for you. So let's get started. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR professional creators, designers, and producers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work in VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm your host, Marcelo Lewin, founder of HowToCreateVR.com. The goal of HowToCreateVR.com is to help you create your next awesome VR experience by becoming your go-to source for VR education. My guest today is Alex May from Vitae. He's an audio designer and a game artist with a multifaceted professional background that combines audio engineering, music production, graphic design, and industrial design. In his latest VR project, Paper Valley, he was in charge of the sound effects, music, audio implementation, and production management. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Marcelo. Nice to meet you, and thanks for having me on the show.
Nice to meet you too. I'm glad to have you on the show. I think you guys posted something on Twitter about your VR project, which we'll get into in just a minute, called Paper Valley. But before we do that, give us a little bit about your background and how did you get into VR?
Sure. Okay. Well, I'm originally from Australia. As you read in that very impressive sounding little biography there, I have kind of a varied background in different disciplines of design. I was in visual design before doing graphic design, also done some work with product design, industrial design, some web design and package design and stuff like that. So it's all kind of visual design work. That being the case, when I was, I think it was 10, my brother, who is quite a bit older than me, took me into his room one day and showed me this shiny new thing that he had on the table. And it was this gray computer, looked somewhat like a Lamborghini Countach, and it was actually a Commodore Amiga 500. And that kind of changed everything at that moment. He slipped in a floppy disk which had Double Dragon 2 on it. And the music for Double Dragon 2 was done by a demo scene musician called Uncle Tom. And I can actually remember my 10 or 11-year-old self being so moved that this computer could be making music like this. It was just like this sort of, my God, like that's what I want to do. The good thing about, those kinds of early PCs or computers versus console games is that, of course, with the computers, you have all the tools right there available for you for giving it a try yourself. So unlike a console game where you can get really inspired, but the best that you can do is just play more or go and buy magazines. In the case of the Commodore Amiga, if you get that inspired by the music, you just go and make music yourself. And that's exactly what I did. And so I was firmly sort of stuck into making music on the Commodore Amiga with the tracker kind of audio programs that they had on the Amiga for many, many, many years, and just really, really enjoying that aspect of creation of music. And that sort of led into producing, techno and electronic music using synthesizers and sequencers and stuff like that. And later in my life, I found myself in Japan. That's where I had the majority of my experience in these different design fields. And yeah, I had a really great friend who was starting his own game company. And he asked me, do you want to come and do some graphics for my game? And that company was called Winning Blimp. And we had some mild success with some mobile games back in, this must have been about, 5 or 6, maybe 7 years ago. And we were very, very fortunate to win the Excellence in Audio Award at the local Bit Summit game event in Kyoto in Japan, where we exhibited one of our games. And at that same event, happened to be also an award-winning game by a Japanese developer called Vitae. And we met on the stage, as you do. Sounds very glamorous, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Met on the stage and basically we got to know each other. And I was very curious about Vitae because they're rather unusual because despite being a Japanese company, they're basically all foreign developers. And so, of course, made it with the common English language, it made it very easy to sort of hit it off immediately. And one thing led to another. And a few years later, actually not a few years, but fairly soon after that, I found myself basically freelancing doing the audio for them, which again, one thing led to another. And then now I work for Vitae Backroom full-time. So that's basically sort of a rough overview of how I got into VR, because that's what they were doing.
That's a really great, interesting background. I remember the Amiga, because my first computer was a Commodore VIC-20. Then I migrated to the 64. I'm older than you. And I remember the Amiga, but I ended up choosing the Mac, the first Mac that came out.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Marcelo, no.
Exactly. So I went that way, and then had the Apple II and all that kind of stuff. So I remember the Amiga being one of those super creative computers. I mean, It was like for the 80s and 90s, it was it.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we're not here to talk about the Amiga, I know, but it's sort of a tragic story, isn't it? I mean, it was so far ahead of its time. There's just no way it could have been commercially successful.
Right. Exactly. But that's for another podcast, for the Amiga podcast. We'll leave it for that one.
Sure.
So you got into VR basically because of Vitae, right?
That's correct.
That's why you got into VR. So what was your first VR experience that you played or you were in?
Sure. The very first VR experience was actually the award-winning game by Vitae, that they had won the award at this Bid Summit game event. That was for a prototype that they made called the Modern Zombie Taxi Driver. Modern Zombie Taxi Driver. Yeah, Modern Zombie Taxi Driver was, after that, picked up by Sony. So the original demo was on the Oculus DK1, and this was in 2013. So it was very, very early days in this, new renaissance of VR that we're in at the moment. My first VR experience was playing that. And to be honest, I didn't enjoy it very much.
Why? Did you get motion sickness or?
Yeah, well, I mean, being the DK1, it was quite primitive. Also, because I wear glasses, I couldn't really see very much because my glasses wouldn't fit in the DK1. So when we were contracted by Sony to work with the PlayStation VR, or it was under a working title called the Morpheus at that stage, it was much, much better because the PlayStation VR, ergonomically, you can really feel Sony's legacy and their experience in industrial design and basically designing things that go on your body because, it's much more comfortable and, I could fit my glasses in there and moving to the PlayStation VR after the Oculus D1 was a DK1 was much more comfortable. And then I sort of started to have a few experiences with VR that I could really enjoy. I'm a bit of a sucker for anything that involves vehicles. So we were privileged to try out a few of the later demos on the PlayStation VR for things like E-Valkyrie, and the other one was Battlezone, and they were great. They were probably the first time that I think E-Valkyrie, the demo for that we played, that was at a PSX event in San Francisco. That's when I really kind of realized, wow, like this is really great, because obviously in a flight simulator, especially one where you're flying a vehicle that has a very large canopy, it changes everything when you can just look around, and it's so easy to be flying your vehicle, but looking up or looking out sideways or, looking around to follow your bogies, I guess, when you're doing dogfighting and stuff like that. And that was probably the first time I really kind of thought, wow, like this is really great.
I think once you do flight simulators in VR, you never want to go back. I've tried X-Plane 11, which I have, and I completely love. I don't know if you've tried that yet.
No, I haven't actually. I think many of your listeners will probably understand that, when you get busy making games, you have such little time to actually play them. One recent game that I tried, one of my very favorite games still now, a year and a half after it came out, is Elite Dangerous. And Elite Dangerous has, it's not a VR game by design. However, you can play it in VR, and it is very, very good in VR. And again, just as you said, once you sort of experience that freedom of being able to sort of track your targets in three-dimensional space, thinking in the sense of like this kind of spaceship simulator or flight simulator, that freedom of being able to watch targets, as they go by, looking up, looking sideways, looking around, it's very, very intoxicating.
Yeah, definitely. It's hard to go back to the regular stuff. So as you mentioned, you moved on to Vitae, and you guys created this new VR experience slash game. I don't know if it's a game or just an experience, but you can tell us more about it, called Paper Valley. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. It is not an experience. Well, it is an experience, but we call it a game. It's not a sort of experience style VR product. It is actually a game. Basically, it is a very, very simple game on the surface. It's about throwing paper planes, and the surface kind of disguises a fairly philosophical back end to the game. We chose paper planes simply because anybody can look at a paper plane and intuitively just sort of understand what they have to do with it. Most of us have thrown a paper plane in our lives, and so it's a very useful sort of game mechanic catalyst to start from, because it's very, very intuitive and very easy to do, and also very enjoyable. That motion of flicking something in VR is very, very enjoyable with touch controllers or the like. So we started off with that, and basically we had this feeling that, well, we need to make more of this than just throwing paper planes at targets, because, that's great for a 5-minute mini game, but it's definitely not going to be holding people for that long. We came across this idea of these paper planes being paper actually growing plants when they hit the ground. And basically then we thought, well, if you miss, they grow a little plant. And if you hit your target, what happens? Well, I guess then you grow a large area of plants. Well, if that's the case, that implies that this land that you're in is decayed and has no growth in it, and you're creating the growth by throwing the planes about. And that was the spark that sort of ignited the whole concept for us. So it is a game. It's a 2-hour experience. It's a sort of a peaceful, relaxing, I guess Zen-like, I suppose you could call it, game, which is all centered around throwing planes at targets. However, as I mentioned, as you play through it, if you're observant, you'll see things around you that start to give you hints and clues to an underlying narrative that gives you reason for what you're doing. We were careful not to actually force that on the player. If they're not really interested in any of that, that's just fine. You can play it as a fun game to be throwing planes at targets. But for those people who are interested in, the question, why am I doing this? What is this for? All of those clues are in there for you to explore and enjoy as you go through.
They will reveal themselves as you play along.
That's right. Yeah, you have to be observant. You have to be looking around you. It's a very sort of passive approach to storytelling.
And you guys created this for the Vive and the Rift?
No, it is actually exclusive for Oculus Rift. Yep, it's an exclusive Rift game. Should things go well in future, we'd love to consider releasing it on Steam and for Vive, or Steam and for Oculus as well. But initially, it's going to be exclusive to Oculus.
Is it released yet, or will it be released soon?
It is actually coming out on Thursday. So that's actually the 19th of April. That is in 3 days from today.
Okay, very cool. So it'll come out in about 3 days, and then is it going to be? How much is it going to cost?
It's going to be $19.99, $19.99. That is not $1,999.
All right, that would be a little too expensive.
And it's going to be available on the Oculus Store. So if you have Oculus Rift, you can go to the Oculus Store, and you should see some. Today, you should see some coming soon banners. But after the 19th of April, you'll see Paper Valley there, and you can search for it, and you'll find it that way.
Excellent. Well, I wish you guys a lot of luck on that game. I'm sure it'll be a hit. Now, what I wanted to do is switch a little bit here into more of your role in this actual game. You're obviously an audio guy. So was that your main role in Paper Valley?
Yeah, that's right. So actually on this particular occasion with this project, I needed to split half doing production management and half doing the audio and the music and the audio implementation. But yeah, my creative role in this project was doing all of the audio.
Okay, so from that point of view, from the audio point of view, you were in charge of everything audio-wise, or were you sound designer, sound mixer, or pretty much the whole shebang?
Yes, I was in charge of everything. So I worked together with our artist. And basically, yeah, together we kind of sculpted the whole plan for the audio, and I was the person who made all the assets and all the music and then did all the implementation. So we're actually just a 4-person team. So it's very, it's 1 person per discipline, basically.
Wow, that's pretty good, though. So why don't you explain the difference between like sound mixing, sound design, sound editing?
Basically, you can break down the creation of sound, be it for VR or for any game project, into a number of different phases. The first phase would be the design phase. And during that phase, what you're doing is essentially figuring out what things need to make sound, what things need to make what kind of sound. And, you'll be working together with the artist and game designer to figure out. Usually you start off with matching things to animation. So whenever something is moving, it generally will be needing a sound generally. So that will be the start of, where you start creating a list to saying, okay, for example, this thing over there moves, so therefore it needs this kind of sound and that kind of sound. So that's the first phase, is designing it. Also, part of that is designing how the music is going to work. And we'll talk about music in VR a little bit more later, I'm sure, but figuring out the music system and the best way to implement it, using what kind of assets you have, what kind of music you're going to be using, and how that affects the music implementation. That all happens in this initial design phase. So following on from that, you get into asset creation. And asset creation is basically the hard slog of actually creating all of these sound asset files. And also, music clips as well that are going to go into the game. Following that, you have the implementation phase, which is where you are taking all of your raw assets and basically hooking them up with the game so that the game plays those assets when things happen. Then the last step is the mixing phase. And mixing basically involves, rudimentarily speaking, it basically involves playing the game a whole lot and adjusting volumes and making sure that, this sounds okay and that sounds, that the volumes are balanced and everything it sort of feels as it should when you're playing. So those are how many was that? 4? I think it was 4. Those are the 4 basic phases.
Sounded like a lot more, but yeah, I think it was 4.
Right.
You mentioned about designing and placing music and placing audio, but with animation, with levels, you can storyboard all this stuff. Do you storyboard the audio as well, or is it part of the game storyboard where when do you, I know you have to go through the design phase where you're figuring this out, but how do you document that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that VR presents an interesting challenge because, a little bit even more beyond your regular, 3D style console game or PC game. The player has freedom to do things that you really, it's really hard to predict, because in order to create that feeling of immersion, you need to give the player a very wide range of freedom with things that they can do in the world that's around them. So, for example, with a regular 3D game, 3D being like a 3D rendered game, you may be able to get away with not allowing the player to, for example, open this drawer. However, in a VR game, if the player goes down to open that drawer and they find that they can't, that breaks that feeling of immersion, that feeling that you're in that space doing that thing. So it becomes even harder to predict the kind of things that the player can do. So therefore, storyboarding, as in trying to create a linear flow for the game to progress through, to take the player along through that experience, becomes really, really difficult. The approach that we've taken for this is basically to simplify the kind of documentation that's required. And basically the target always just has to be realism. So if there's a chest of drawers there, then the player's going to open them. So you need some kind of sound for that. Okay, so we write that down. If, there's a light switch on the wall, then the player's going to probably want to switch it. So you need a sound for that. So basically a list. It's not very glamorous and it's not very cool, but basically a list is the raw planning tool that you start off with, or that we start off with. Making a list, okay, well, in this room we have all of these things that do this that have these functions that the player may actually interact with. Therefore, we need these sounds. In the next room, well, we had a light switch sound from the previous one, so we can reuse that. We have this drawer sound, and we can reuse that for these drawers as well. And you basically sort of work through the different areas of the game one by one, essentially, and just going through designing and listing up the things that you need just as one great big list. So sadly, at least in the experiences that in the games that we've worked on, there's never really been the opportunity to storyboard things in such a linear fashion, just because it's really, really hard to predict what the player is going to do.
And that makes a lot of sense, because what you're doing is you're attaching audio to assets, right, that happen to be in an environment. So that totally makes sense. It's not really linear because when I'm in a room, like you said, you don't know what I'm going to do. I may open the drawer, I may turn on the light, I may slam the door, whatever it is. You need to have all those. But let's talk about music now. So how does music fit in? Because music could be both background music. It could be music in reference to me finding or leveling up or finding a goal or something else, right? So is that in a storyboard? Is that within a timeline? Explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, music is very complicated in VR, and we've found that a very simplistic approach tends to work the best. Basically, our experience beyond doing our experience beyond doing VR games for, Vive and Rift is basically doing arcade VR games. Japan, where Vitae Backroom is based, arcade VR games are very popular, and in the arcade situation, it presents a different kind of challenge than what you would experience in the sort of the so-called regular VR game that you would play on your PC at home. That is that if the player is using headphones or if the audio is coming at them through external speakers in the arcade, they're not going to really be able to hear much subtlety. They're not going to be able to hear much of the nuance in what you do with the music because they're surrounded by noise, basically. In an arcade environment, it's really noisy. And so any kind of subtlety that you go for with the music becomes really, really difficult to do convincingly. Our approach because of that, has become very, very simple. Firstly, with music in VR, you have two options. The first option is to have an obvious visual source for where the music is coming from. And that could be, for example, like a radio sitting on the table. Or it could be, a speaker on the ceiling that looks like is piping music into the room. Basically giving a visual cue to say the reason that you can hear music right now is because of this. You can see it right there, and that's what's producing the music, and that's where the music is sourced. It's coming from there. That's the first approach. When you can't do that because of whatever reason, for example, it's an environment that doesn't lend itself to having a speaker there or a radio there or any obvious source of music, then your options become more complicated. When I said earlier that we've taken a simplistic approach, our simplistic approach is basically to kind of do the not so cool thing and basically have music pumped into your headphones as just regular 2D sound. So that means if you have the left and the right speakers of your headphones on your ears, as you move your head, the music stays with your head as you look around. It doesn't remain stationary in the world. It's actually attached to your head. So it's kind of like you're in the VR world with a pair of headphones on. Now that approach is not always great because, yes, indeed, it can sort of break that feeling of immersion because it's not natural to have sound that there's music coming from somewhere that's attached to your head as you look around. The reason that we've chosen to do that in most cases is because, again, in the arcade situation where we've done most of our work, you're not really going to be able to hear any subtlety anyway because it's so loud outside of your headphones. So that's why we've always gone for the simplistic approach of just having music coming and being attached to your head. That's never really presented a problem in the arcade environment with, players feeling like, the music seemed unnatural. The music was coming from nowhere, even though I couldn't see where the music was coming from and it was attached to my head. We're sort of hoping that the player will give us the benefit of the doubt and say, well, this is a game and, I've got music attached to my head, but yeah, whatever. If we can actually distract the player with music that's so captivating anyway, they tend not to notice. So that's been our approach with the arcade projects. With Paper Valley, we actually tried experimenting with a few other different approaches to doing this second style of music where the music is coming from somewhere. One thing I tried was actually having a source of music on top of the player's head. So actually above the player's head, the music will be coming from there and it's stereo. So the intention there was to make it feel like the music was in the world. So if as you moved your head, something is changing in the stereo mix, but you can't quite figure out what it is, but it sort of feels like it's not attached to your head. It's independent of your head. So the world is full of music from somewhere, and we just sort of, gloss over the detail of where it's coming from. But it's with you all the time, and as you turn your head, you can hear that it's kind of the something is changing, so it's in the world and it's not attached to your head. Tried that. We also tried having music directly in front of the player, so it's actually like it's coming from in front of you. And again, the same thing. So with that, if you turn to one side, you'll only hear it in one ear. So it's actually a source that's coming from in front of you. We tried that. I think we drew that we were going to try actually separating the music into a left side and a right side, and have that on the left and the right side of the player as they're looking forward. Again, meaning that if you turn your head, the stereo field will change because you'll be looking at the left side or you'll be looking at the right side directly. So we tried a number of these things. And at the end of it all, we basically came back to what was most simple, which is just locking it to the player's head. The reason that we did that is because one thing that is very helpful with any kind of game music is stereo width. So basically that means, mono is a single source of sound right in front of you, and wide stereo is where the left side and the right side seem to be very, very distant on your left and right side ear. So if you listen to a regular piece of pop music these days, most of them are mixed to be extremely wide, so that when you listen to them through headphones, it just has this really huge kind of stereo stage inside your head that you're listening to. So that's a very useful thing to make music sound much more dramatic. And the problem with doing all of these kinds of tricky things with placing music in the VR world is that it tends to make that stereo stage much narrower. So the result of that is that music will just tend to sound a bit less dramatic and a bit less impactful. And we didn't want to sacrifice it when it came down to the choice between, do we want very wide dramatic music that's locked to the player's head, or do we want more narrow music that feels like it's coming out of the world somehow? We chose the former of those two options because we wanted to prioritize the musical impact. That was probably much more of an answer than you're hoping for, I think. But
No. It's a great answer. And I'm assuming those choices also would change depending if it's more of a background or ambiance music versus a foreground or main music, right? To emphasize something.
Yeah, that's right. So in our game, we only really wanted in Paper Valley, there's two kinds of music. There's the background music, which is a very, 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 very simple drone kind of texture, which gradually changes as you move through the different levels of the game. And then we have like a cue, which sort of alerts the player that, something has happened now, or you found something, or you've reached a certain point in the level. So in our case, I actually set it up so that we have the background music and the foreground music all set up the same. So I didn't actually, you do have that choice, as you just mentioned, you do have that choice to set them up differently. But in our case, we just kept it to being really, really simple so that it's all set up the same, regardless if it's background or foreground.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about haptics and audio and how can audio work together with haptics? And let me clarify that by saying, for example, when you throw the paper plane, I'm assuming this because I haven't played it since it's not out yet, but maybe you get some vibration, right? Because you let go of the plane. Does audio help emphasize that vibration, that haptic feeling, even though it's purely digital?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all really about just sort of finding as many pieces of that puzzle to convince the player that they're actually there. And just like vibration is a tool to make the player feel like they're doing this, or they're hitting something or something like that, sound works in exactly the same way. So that means that you can get away without either of those. You could have no haptic feedback at all and just have a sound, or you could have haptic feedback and no sound, but you'd be losing out. So it's not so much a necessity, but the more things that you can do to convince the player that this is what it feels like and this is what it sounds like, the more effective it's going to be in convincing the player that they're actually doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of convincing them, let's talk about the Doppler effect. Explain what that is, number one, and then also explain how is that implemented in VR.
Okay, that's a big one, isn't it? So the Doppler effect, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, Doppler effect is a physics phenomenon which you would notice most obviously when you're standing on the street and a police car or a fire engine goes past. And you'll hear the pitch of the siren. It will sound higher as it's coming towards you. It will be at its actual pitch when it's right next to you. And then as it goes away from you, it will sound lower pitched. And the reason that happens is because obviously sound travels as waves through the air. And as the object is moving towards you, the waves that it's producing are actually being compressed as they come towards you, which basically it changes the wavelength of what the sound is coming at you, which changes the pitch. So when it's going away from you, the opposite is happening. So the waves are actually being elongated because the object is moving away, and that then extends that wavelength, which then causes the pitch to sound like it's lower. So in VR, as far as I'm aware, right now, the out-of-the-box middleware tools such as Fmod, Wise, and of course the audio tools that you have available to you in Unreal and Unity and the game engines does not support Doppler. So that means that there's no way to make a sound that's coming at you. Like if it's a car that's driving towards you, there's no automatic way to make it sound higher pitched as it's coming towards you and then lower pitched as it's going away for you. There's no automatic way to do that. Larger audio teams, of course, find ways around that. And it's not too difficult to get around that. Basically, you need to measure the velocity of the car as it's moving, and you need to be aware of the distance as it's getting closer. And then you can actually tie those parameters, those values, as the car is moving towards you, to the pitch as it's being reproduced by the audio engine to sort of brute force your way through like a hack for Doppler effect. But yeah, as far as I'm aware right now, there's no automatic solution for doing that in the tools that we have. I might be wrong, but that's the extent of my knowledge at this stage.
Like built in within Unity on Unreal, you mean?
Yeah, so basically you just click a button and turn on Doppler, and now everything sounds as it should when it's moving toward you or away from you. I don't think there's an automated way to do that.
Because I'm assuming you could write some sort of library, right? That with a function that allows you to do that. But like you said, you have to write these. They're not built into the engines yet.
Yeah, and this is the difficult and often frustrating part of being a very, very small team. I'm sure many of your listeners who work for small teams will kind of be able to relate to this, that, anything is basically possible if you have enough time and you have enough people available to figure it out. And Doppler effect is one of those things. So in the more big budget games, if you listen carefully, probably they have, great special bespoke functions that they've created to actually reproduce Doppler effect. Also things like sound occlusion. That means if you're standing behind a wall, the sound will sound different than if you go around the wall and you're in direct line of the sound source. That's going to sound different too. So all of these things are definitely possible, but it just takes time to set it all up, and that of course requires labor power, which requires budget. So it all kind of fits together like that.
Right, definitely. The more real you want to get it, obviously, the more work it's going to be. Exactly.
So our challenge has been, because we're such a small team, and generally prior to Paper Valley, we've worked on several arcade games for the Japanese VR arcade market. And in these cases, the time frames are extremely short. We're talking like about 3 months for a whole game. And the budgets are, unfortunately, candidly speaking, quite low, which means that you don't really have the, it basically becomes an issue of compromises. We need to get the most realistic results as fast as we can. So yeah, you don't really have the means to go about getting all of these kinds of custom solutions for these things that aren't automated in the tools that you have.
But to be fair, what you just described sounds just about like any other project I've ever worked on.
Right.
Give me the most at the shortest time at the lowest price.
That's right. Have all of our cakes and let's all eat them together.
Exactly. So can you define or explain spatial audio or 3D audio?
Sure. Okay. 3D audio is definitely nothing new. It's been around for quite a long time now. Basically, simplistically speaking, you have stereo, which is, left speaker, right speaker. So if you think of watching a movie, what you're basically listening to is stereo, because you have something on the left side of the screen and it will come out of the left speaker. And as they walk across the frame, you'll gradually fade down the left side and fade up the right side. So it sounds like the sound source is like moving across that two-dimensional stereo field. Now, three-dimensional audio, there's two kinds that we should define here in relation to VR. So in VR audio development, when we talk about 3D audio, generally what we're talking about is audio that has been spatialized by the audio engine. Now, by spatialized, I don't mean that there's anything tricky going on. It just basically means that the objects in the game world that exist on a three-dimensional plane around the player these audio sources are being placed by the audio engine, so that, for example, if something is in front and to the left, it will sound slightly on the left side. If something is behind and to the left, it will sound also slightly on the left side until you turn your head. And then you'll realize that, oh, it's actually behind me or it's in front of me. So the big limitation of regular 3D audio in VR is simulating that sense of in front and behind. And the audio engines with their default out-of-the-box settings do a pretty good job at simulating it using some very basic things. Those would be, like, one obvious thing is a low-pass filter. A low-pass filter is a kind of filter that essentially makes it sound more muffled, because things that are behind you will be slightly more muffled than things that are in front of you just because of the shape of your ears. Our human ears are tuned to be, most receptive to sounds in front. And so that's kind of the really simple way that these audio engines will simulate the depth of sound in front or behind in 3D audio. Now, the second kind of 3D audio in relation to VR is usually known as spatialized audio, 3D spatialization, binaural, all different kinds of names for it. What's happening in these cases is the in front and behind and, to a certain extent, above and below, these are being simulated by using some really, really, really tricky technology. The way that it works is with audio, we have what's called phase. Phase is where you have two signals that are slightly shifted apart. So the wavelength between them is slightly shifted apart. So if you're listening to a piece of, let's say you're listening to like a synthesizer sound in your left ear and the same synthesizer sound in your right ear, if it's exactly the same and it is synced up exactly so that the actual waveform is identical, then that's actually mono. So you'll hear the sound right in front of you. Or if you're wearing headphones, basically right in the center of your head, you'll hear it. Now, when you shift one of those waveforms slightly out of synchronization, slightly forward or slightly back, we get a physical phenomenon which is called phasing. And basically, when you listen to it, it's hard. I think most people will probably be able to relate to what it sounds like because you may have heard it before, but it's hard to describe with words, but it's sort of this really odd sensation where it sounds like the sound is kind of almost like turning inside out somehow. And it just sort of sounds this really weird sensation of the sound not really coming from the center of your head, but sort of coming from somewhere. It's really, really hard to describe with words. Anyway, the 3D spatialization tools that are available for VR projects and for regular game projects too, the way they work is they do all kinds of trickery with phase shifting, like I just described. And if you do that very, very carefully and manage these kinds of sound reproduction very, very carefully, you can actually simulate the sound of something coming from in front of you as opposed to from behind you, and it actually sounds like that. I'm sure all of us have probably had the experience of trying these kinds of 3D sound demos where you have, like, for example, a fly that's flying around your head, and it actually sounds like it's going behind you. That's all done with really complicated treatment of phase on the left and the right speaker. So as it relates to VR, 3D audio refers to basically those two things. The first one being just generally sounds that are positioned in 3D space by the audio engine. Essentially, all it is just left and right in your headphones. Usually because you can see something in front of you and you hear it on the left side, you'll kind of associate that, oh, it's coming from in front of me. Or it's slightly muffled, okay, it's coming from behind me. And then the second kind is these kinds of more custom 3D spatialization solutions. And there are quite a few of them out there these days.
And as a creator, I'm assuming you're not worried so much about the mechanics and all that stuff that goes underneath that to make it work. You're worrying about, as a creator, where to position it, and it takes care of making it sound like it's in front or behind you, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So from the creation side, You don't really need to be worried too much about that at all. You can basically leave it to the plugin, so to speak, to handle all of that. The thing you do need to worry about is obviously when you come to the mixing phase that I mentioned earlier as part of sound creation, that final mixing phase, does it sound realistic? And just dropping in a 3D spatialization kind of plugin into your audio middleware or into Unreal or Unity or whatever you're using isn't like a one-stop solution for making the sound more realistic. This we know because in our case, we rarely have the budget all the time to actually pursue these kinds of custom solutions for spatialized 3D audio. So my job has always been basically trying to make the most realistic sound out of just regular 3D audio. And yeah, there are a few kind of tricks that I've kind of put together to do that, which we can talk about in a moment, I guess.
And I'm assuming to make this realistic in VR, you truly have to be an incredible audio observant in real life. What I mean by that is we take things for granted, right? Like the wind going through a tree, but you've got to really understand that to be able to duplicate it in VR.
Absolutely. That's absolutely critical. And it's not difficult. Basically all it requires is, if you're walking down the street, don't think about anything else. Just concentrate on your ears. What's going on? A simple example. If you're walking into a headwind, so the wind is coming directly at you, a really simple example is try turning your head to the left. And you'll notice that you can't hear the wind anymore. And why is that? Well, that's because when you're looking into the wind is blowing across your ear hole. And just like you can make a sound by blowing on the top of a glass bottle, the wind is doing that and actually resonating in the ear hole, which creates that sound of the wind. But when you turn left, you turn your head to the left, now the wind is going directly into your ear, but there's no kind of hole for it to be resonating over, so you don't hear it. So little things like that, I think in everyday life, it's very easy to forget, but it's also very easy to just be more conscious of, why does this make that sound? Why is it that I can hear this in this situation, but I can't hear it in that situation? Why does, for example, that drawer that we were talking about earlier, why does it make that creaking sound? What is it that's actually making that sound, and what's producing that sound? And all of these kinds of basic, really, really basic, I guess I like to call it armchair acoustic science.
Right.
It's like there's no proper scientific technique or anything behind, but it's just basically thinking to yourself. And that is absolutely critical, and it's not difficult, and it's great fun just to sort of entertain yourself with those kinds of curiosities and thoughts.
But it seems that creating audio for VR is a great mixture of both science, observing and figuring things out, but also of art.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, if creating sound for a game was simply, we have an open draw sound, okay, there's that asset done. We have a light switch sound, okay, there's that asset done. If that's all that sound in video games is, then, anybody could do it. And basically our games would be very, very boring, because just like, with art, it's interesting. Things in art for games, like visual art, things that look hyper real are very impressive. Things that just look plainly realistic are usually not that impressive. And just the same with sound. It works exactly the same way. How do you make the sound of this draw hyper real so that it's actually impressive? But beyond that as well, what are you emotionally trying to do with this sound? What's the feeling that you want the player to have? And you have the power with sound design to actually influence that. Do you want the player to feel tension as they open this drawer? Or do you want them to feel that they've done something right? Or that they've achieved something, or they succeeded something? Or do you want them to feel that they've done something wrong, that they shouldn't be opening this drawer? And VR is great because unlike in a regular game, you can actually rely to a certain extent on a lot of visual cues to tell the player that they're doing the right thing or they're doing the wrong thing. The tricky part with VR is that because it needs to be very, very realistic, you don't go to a drawer, open it, and have all these, particles and sparks coming out and fireworks and stuff. That just doesn't happen in real life, and that's going to break your sense of immersion. So you don't really have the freedom to do too much with what's happening visually, generally, unless it's a fantasy game where that kind of thing is justified. However, with audio, you have complete freedom to kind of pull the sound in either way. If you want it to sound tense, or you want it to sound satisfying, or you want it to sound incorrect or whatever. So yeah, it's absolutely critical that as you said, that you're observant about sounds, but you're also thinking about what is it that you want to achieve emotionally with each one of these sounds.
Yeah, it's amazing that after talking to you for, I think, about 50 minutes now, it opened up my mind, because one of the things we're impressed with when we put on the HMDs is the visuals. You go, oh my God, look at this. We're in this experience, and the visuals are amazing, but you take audio really for granted, and it's sort of a second thought as a player, as a viewer, right? But you take the audio out, and it would be a completely different kind of experience. So it really is a mixture of great skill with a bunch of art behind it, right? Because like you said, it's not just how do you do it, but what do you want to get out of this emotion-wise?
Exactly. And, it's kind of like being a bass player in a band.
Right.
If the bass player is really, really good, you're not going to notice them playing. And, it's not going to, well, I mean, in some genres of music, obviously it does stand out, but generally, the bass player is there, and they're kind of in the back, and they're doing their thing, holding it down, keeping everything solid. The minute that they stop playing, all of a sudden it's like, whoa, wait a moment, this sounds really weird and awful and horrible and unbalanced.
Or the minute that you notice what they're doing is when they messed up.
That's right. In the case of a live performance, yeah, that's exactly right.
Right. It's kind of like VFX, right? The invisible VFX of movies. When you start noticing the visual effects is when you realize these guys aren't doing their job correctly.
Yeah, exactly. So what that means for when you're creating audio for VR, it doesn't necessarily mean that, everything has to be really difficult and really complicated and really advanced. You certainly can get away with things just being realistic. And that's where you play just like, I guess, the more conservative bass player in a rock band, you could say. They're not doing amazing things, but they're just holding down the bottom end, forming that link between the harmony and the rhythm. And, they're just sort of doing their thing. And that I would equate to just realistic sound in a VR game. However, you also have the opportunity to be doing much more than that by catering to emotion and trying to create an emotional response, because what you can't do visually, you have all the freedom to do with the sound. And so, yeah, you definitely have those opportunities open to you as well. So I don't want to give the impression that, audio for VR games is really hard and it's really complicated, and it can be very, very simple. It also can be extremely, extremely effective. You're able to put in a little bit extra as far as the artistic goal and the emotional goal.
Right, but the key here is that you think of audio as an art, and not just as let's just add a little sound to this drawer opening and closing, because it really is an art. So we're out of time, but I could talk to you for another hour, to be honest with you. I have more questions, and that, to me, that means that we're going to have you back here, and hopefully you'll agree to that. We'll see about when you guys launch the game. Maybe, a couple of months later, we'll get you back here to talk about the game, and also just to continue our conversation, because you've been a wealth of information, and at least from my perspective, you really opened up my eyes and my ears into what it takes to do audio, and not only the technical art behind it, but just in general. You really have to know what you're doing here to do this right.
Yeah, well, yeah, thanks. It's been my pleasure, and absolutely, I would love the privilege to be on the show again. I hope I didn't talk too much.
Not at all. Now, I will have two last questions for you, because I believe they're super important. Number one is, for people that are in audio that want to get into VR, what skills do you recommend they should have? What tools do you think they should know? Let's try to keep it a little short here, since we're almost out of time. But if you can give them a quick summary of what should they need to know today to really be able to jump into VR?
So the short answer to that is that you need to firstly define whether you want to be in sound effects or music. You can do both, but they are quite different disciplines that require quite different skill sets. So that will be the first thing to decide. As far as tools, you don't need to have Pro Tools. Pro Tools is like the kind of industry standard for post-production and sound effects and music mixing. Any one of the DAWs out there, like Logic or Cubase or Ableton Live or Reaper or any of these, they're going to do a perfectly adequate job that you need. So you need to have something like that, and you need to be very, very familiar with it. So that will be the second thing. Third thing is definitely middleware. So Unity and Unreal have built-in sound engines, and they are quite capable. However, they are not on the level of, say, Wise or Fmod. Wwise and Fmod are middleware tools specifically designed for game audio, and they are absolutely incredible because they give the audio person all the control that they need and, lighten the load for the programmers, basically. So I would definitely say that learning those middleware tools is absolutely essential for being able to work effectively with the team doing a VR game.
Excellent. Those are excellent tips. My last question to you is a question I ask all of my guests is, describe what you would like VR to be like in the year 2025. Not what you think it's going to be like, but what you would love it to be like.
To be honest, I'm very excited by AR. And I think that VR is fantastic, but I would love I think the Ready Player One movie does it, where basically people are wearing like AR goggles, where they're more or less like sunglasses that you can see through. However, there's like a VR mode where you can switch them into.
They can go in and out. Yeah.
Yeah. That I think would be, that's where I would like it to be in 2025, simply because VR is fantastic and it's wonderful, but physically it can still be cumbersome because you can't see anything. You have this thing on your head. I would love it. I love the hardware to be lighter and to give you the capability to kind of switch it off and be able to see things more easily. So you don't have to sort of constantly be switching on and off this great big helmet. That's where I would like it to be in 2025.
Let's just hope that the dystopian part of Ready Player One doesn't come true, though.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, that would be totally awesome. Well, Alex, I really, really appreciate you coming on my podcast and sharing all this wonderful information. I really appreciate it.
Marcel, it's been an absolute pleasure. So I look forward to next time.
Definitely. Now, if people want to get a hold of you or learn more about you or Paper Valley, just give URLs, emails, whatever you want.
Please get in touch with me on Twitter. Twitter is where I like to be. My handle is ATYPE A-type 808. That's A-type 808. No funny characters. If you're interested in Paper Valley, the best place to go for information about that is on Twitter, Paper Valley VR.
And we'll go ahead and put show notes here too with all those links as well. So, Alex, thank you so much. And to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with me. If you enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and like us on iTunes or SoundCloud. For more episodes, check out howtocreatevr.com/iTunes or howtocreatevr.com/SoundCloud. If you are ever in the Southern California area, we have a monthly meetup with lots of great presentations. You can join or RSVP for our next meetup at howtocreatevr.com/meetup. Finally, if you are interested in learning more about how to create VR experiences, please visit howtocreatevr.com. So until the next episode, I'm your host, Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.